The wind changed first. It came down off the mesa smelling of copper and wet stone, though no rain had fallen in 6 weeks. The cattle in the lower pasture bunched together and would not graze. A horned owl that had nested in the old cottonwood for 3 seasons left before sundown and did not come back. Then the moon rose full and orange behind a scrim of dust, and something screamed in the arroyo, not a coyote, not a bobcat, but something with lungs too big for its throat. Elias Vance stood on the porch with his father's rifle across his arms and did not move. He had heard that scream before, 10 years before, the night they buried what was left of his father in a box too light for a grown man. It was closer this time. He raised the rifle. Somewhere below, in the mesquite, 2 amber eyes opened in the dark and held on him, patient, almost recognizing him, before the scene cut to black. Elias Vance had been 8 years old the last time his father tucked him into a bed, and 23 the first time he understood what killed him. The town of Sable Hollow sat in a shallow bowl of the New Mexico territory, ringed by dry hills the color of old bone. A place that had been carved out of Apache land only a generation before, and still remembered it, in the wary way small towns remember things, never spoken of directly, always present at the edges of a conversation. The wars were over now, mostly. Treaties signed, reservations drawn, soldiers gone home or gone to other frontiers. What remained was an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles over a place after violence rather than after peace. Thomas Vance had been a rancher, broad through the shoulders, slow to anger and slower to forgive, a man who taught his son to read brands and set snares before he taught him to read words. He was, by every account Elias had gathered since, a decent man, not a gentle one. Decent. He died, or the town said he died, on a November night when Elias was 13. He had gone out after a sheep that had wandered from the flock, taken his rifle because the hills had grown strange that autumn, livestock found torn open but not eaten, tracks too large and too upright to belong to any wolf a trapper could name. He did not come back. 3 men found him 2 days later in a dry wash a mile from the house, and what they found they would not let the boys see. They buried him quickly. They told Elias a mountain lion had done it, though everyone who had looked into that pine box and come out white-faced knew that was a lie meant for a child, not a fact meant for a coroner. For 10 years, Elias had built his life around that lie the way a man builds a house around a crack in the foundation, carefully and never looking directly at the crack. He ran the ranch alone now, his mother having died of a fever 3 winters after his father, leaving him the land, the cattle, and a silence he had never learned to fill. He did not marry. He did not go to church, though he sat in the back pew most Sundays because it was easier than explaining why he didn't. He worked from before light to after dark, and at night, when the coyotes called across the flats, he still felt 13 years old, still felt his stomach drop the way it had the morning the men rode up to the house with their hats already off. The killings began again in September. First a horse, found gutted in its stall, the barn door untouched, no tracks leading in or out that any local hand could read. Then a hired man from the Callahan spread, found in the same dry wash where Thomas Vance had been found a decade before, as if something had chosen the place on purpose, the way a man returns to a favorite chair. By October, there had been 4 deaths and no arrests, no explanation the sheriff would put in writing. The town did what frightened towns do. It looked for someone to blame, and when it could not find a man, it began, in low voices, in kitchens and behind barns, to speak of older words. Lobo hombre, skinwalker. The old Spanish families crossed themselves. The younger ones laughed too loudly and locked their doors. Elias did not laugh. He had seen the tracks near the wash himself 2 weeks before, out checking a fence line at dusk. A print too long for a wolf, too narrow for a bear, with the unmistakable weight distribution of something that walked, at least part of the time, on two legs. He had stood over that print for a long while, and something in his chest that had been quiet for 10 years woke up and would not go back to sleep. He decided that night that he would not wait for the sheriff, or the town, or the next body in the wash. He rode into Sable Hollow the following morning and asked at the mercantile, at the livery, at the saloon that opened at 9 for men with nothing better to do, whether anyone knew a tracker good enough to follow something that left almost no trail. Most men laughed him off. One old freighter, loading salt at the depot, did not laugh. "There's a man camps out past the agency line," the freighter said, not looking up from his work. "Won't come into town for money. Might come out for something else." He named no name. He gave no more than a direction. South, along the dry creek past the cottonwoods, to a bend where a man sometimes fished with more patience than luck. Elias found him there 2 days later, a lean man of perhaps 50, grey, threading his braid, sitting so still on the bank that Elias nearly rode past without seeing him. The man did not turn when the horse's hooves crunched the gravel behind him. "You're loud," the man said, in English worn smooth by long use, without turning his head. "For a man hunting something quiet." Elias reined up, feeling suddenly foolish. A stranger with a rifle and a debt he could not explain. "I need a tracker," he said. "Something's killing livestock, and people both, out past the Callahan land. Leaves near nothing behind. I was told you might know how to follow it." The man was quiet long enough that Elias thought he'd been dismissed. Then, "What do you have to pay with?" Elias's face went hot. He had exactly $2 folded in his shirt pocket, saved from selling a calf that spring, money meant for salt and coffee he now would not be buying. He took the 2 crumpled bills out and held them across the space between them, feeling the absurdity of the gesture even as he made it. The man turned, finally, and looked at the money and then at Elias's face for a long moment. Not at the bills again, but at him, the way a man reads weather, or a wound. $2, he said, to hunt a thing that killed 4 people and skinned a horse alive in its own stall. A dry, humorless sound, not quite a laugh. "You couldn't pay me what this is worth if you sold that ranch of yours twice over." Elias lowered his hand. "Then I'll find someone else. I didn't say I wouldn't come." The man rose, unhurried, and began coiling his fishing line with the same economy of motion he did everything else. "I said you couldn't pay what it's worth. That's different from saying I want your money." He looked at Elias again, longer this time, something assessing behind his eyes. "I've heard the name Vance before. There was a rancher by that name years back, torn apart in a wash south of here. Same wash the Callahan man died in last month." "My father," Elias said. The man nodded slowly as though this confirmed something he had already half known. "Then you're not hunting a stranger's trouble," he said. "You're hunting your own." He shouldered his gear. "That's worth more than $2 and less. Come on, we'll talk on the way." He did not give his name that day or the next. By the 3rd day of tracking, 3 days of the man reading sign that Elias couldn't see at all, broken grass, a claw mark 6 feet up a cottonwood trunk, scat with fragments of bone too large for any wolf. Elias had started quietly to trust him more than he'd trusted anyone since his mother died. It was somewhere on that 3rd evening, crouched over a dying fire while the tracker studied a print in the mud by lamplight, that Elias finally asked, "You never told me your name." The man didn't look up right away. "Names are a debt," he said. "You don't hand them out before you know what you owe someone and what they owe you." He set the lamp down, and for the first time, something almost like warmth crossed his face. "Etchohana," he said. "It means the one who waits. My mother thought it was funny, giving that name to a child who couldn't sit still for a meal." "Elias," Elias said, though the man clearly already knew it. Etchohana studied him another moment, then looked back down at the print in the mud. A print with toes too long, a stride too wide, weight settled unmistakably on the ball of a foot that was built, at least sometimes, to stand upright. "This is close," he said quietly, "and it isn't afraid of you. That's the part that should frighten you more than the size of it. If this story has its hooks in you already, that's the moment to hit subscribe, so you don't miss where this trail leads." Etchohana did not believe in mountain lions that walked on two legs, and he said so plainly around the fire that night in the tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. "I've tracked cougars since I was younger than you," he said. "I've tracked wolves, and men pretending to be wolves, which is a different and uglier thing. This isn't either." He turned the print he'd cast in plaster over in his hands, studying the claw marks at the tips of the toes, too long, too deliberate, gouged deep even in packed earth. "This walks like a man half the time, runs on all fours the other half, and it isn't hunting for food. A hungry animal eats where it kills. This one kills and leaves the meat and takes something else." "Takes what?" Etchohana didn't answer that directly. Instead he asked, "Your father, when they found him, did they let you see him?" "No." The word came out rougher than Elias intended. "They said it wasn't fit." "Did anyone say what was missing?" Elias went still. He had never once, in 10 years, heard anyone speak of his father's body in terms of what was missing, only in terms of what had been done. The question opened a door he had spent a decade nailing shut. "I don't know," he said. "I never asked. I was 13. "You're not 13 now." Etchohana's voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It was the voice of a man handing over a weight because he believed the other man could carry it. "Tomorrow we go to the wash, not to track the thing, to look at what it left." They rode out before first light, the sky the color of a healing bruise, and reached the dry wash as the sun cleared the hills. It was, Elias realized with a lurch in his stomach, nearly the exact bend of the arroyo where his father had been found. Etchohana dismounted and walked the ground slowly, silently, for the better part of an hour, while Elias sat his horse and watched, unable to make himself get down. When Etchohana finally straightened, he was holding something small between two fingers. A fragment of bone, old weathered pale by years of sun, half buried until his search had turned it up. "This isn't from the Callahan man," he said. "This has been here longer. Years." He turned it in the light. "Look!" Elias made himself dismount, made himself look. It was a knucklebone, human, unmistakably worn smooth by weather, and along one edge, faint but visible when the light caught it right, 4 parallel grooves, claw marks, old ones. "That's not proof of anything," Elias said, though his voice had gone thin. "No," Etchohana agreed. "It's a question." He wrapped the bone carefully in a scrap of cloth and put it away. 10 years ago, something killed your father in this wash. This year, something is killing people in this wash, and it walks like the thing that made this mark. Either two different monsters have chosen the same mile of dry ground to hunt in, 10 years apart, or one monster never left. "He's dead," Elias said. "I know he's dead. I didn't see the body, but I know. Do you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Or do you know that a box was buried, and a man never came home, and everyone around you agreed not to look too closely at the difference between those two facts?" Elias said nothing. Around them, the wash held its silence, indifferent, patient, the way a place that has swallowed something can afford to be patient. They camped that night closer to the wash than either of them said out loud they wanted to. Elias didn't sleep. Sometime past midnight he heard it, not a scream this time, but something worse, a long, low sound that was almost a groan, almost a word, coming from somewhere in the brush not 50 yards off. Etchohana was already awake. rifle across his knees, watching the dark with the stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime being still. "It's not hunting tonight," he said quietly. "It's watching." "Watching what?" "You." Etchohana didn't look away from the dark. "It's been watching you for a while, I think, since before you hired me." The sound came again, closer, and this time Elias could not unhear in its ragged register something almost human trying to claw its way up through an animal throat. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the grey hour before dawn, sitting with his back against a boulder and his father's rifle across his knees, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in 10 years. He let himself remember his father's face, not the black box they'd buried, not the men's white faces riding up to the house, but his father alive, the particular amber brown of his eyes in lamplight, a color Elias had inherited and always privately thought was the one good thing his mirror gave back to him. He thought of the eyes in the mesquite the night before Etchohana had come, patient, recognizing. He did not say any of this aloud, but something in him, quiet and terrible, had already begun to understand what the tracker was circling toward, and he was not ready, not yet, to hear it said in words. They widened the search after that, moving out from the wash in slow rings, and what they found over the following days built a picture neither of them wanted assembled. Etchohana found a den first, not a cave, but a collapsed line shack 1.5 miles from the Vance ranch, roof fallen in, walls gone grey and soft with age. Inside, beneath a drift of blown sand, they found the remains of a life lived in hiding. A bedroll rotted to little more than fibre, tin cups rusted through, and folded with a care that struck Elias harder than any of it. A shirt, homespun, faded, a pattern his mother had sewn with her own hands into the collar, a small stitched sun, her signature on every garment she'd ever made for her husband. Elias held it without speaking for a long time. "He's been out here," Etchohana said quietly, watching him, some part of him thinking, at least at first. "Enough to keep a shirt he couldn't wear anymore. Why didn't he come home?" The question came out of Elias, broken in the middle, the voice of the 13-year-old he'd been trying not to be for 10 years. If some part of him was still, if he could still think. "I don't know," Etchohana said, and it was the first time Elias had heard him admit uncertainty about anything. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe the change took more of him each time, until there wasn't enough man left to remember the way home. Or maybe... He paused, choosing the next words with visible care. Maybe he knew what he'd become, and loved you enough to stay away from it. Elias folded the shirt and did not answer. They asked questions in town after that, carefully, the way you press a bruise to see how deep it goes. An old woman who'd nursed sick livestock for 30 years remembered when pressed that Thomas Vance had come to her once, the summer before he died, asking in a roundabout way about a dog that had gone strange after being bitten by something in the hills, whether an animal could carry a sickness that changed its nature, made it violent, made it forget itself. She'd thought little of it at the time. A man asking about a dog. The freighter at the depot, when Elias returned to thank him for the tip that had led him to Etchohana, admitted after some prodding that he'd heard years back, second-hand and half-believed, that the men who found Thomas Vance's body had argued about what to bury, that there had been talk, quickly hushed, of the body not being entirely a body when they found it. He would not say more than that. He looked, when he said even that much, like a man sorry he'd started talking. Piece by piece, the shape of it settled over Elias like cold water. His father had not died in that wash 10 years ago. He had been bitten, changed, and something in him, shame or fear or a mercy no one had thought to call by that name, had kept him from ever coming home again. The men who found what was left of a mauled sheep and torn earth that November night had found signs of an attack and buried an empty box, or perhaps a stranger's remains, or perhaps nothing at all, and told a grieving widow and a frightened boy the kindest lie they could construct. 10 years. 10 years his father had lived, if lived was even the word, in the hills behind the ranch, half a mile at most from the house where his son grew up believing him gone, watching, perhaps, on the nights the moon rose full, and something in the wash screamed. "I need to see him," Elias said, the night this understanding finally settled into something he could say aloud. "Whatever's left of him. I need to see it myself." Etchohana looked at him across the fire for a long moment. "You understand what you're asking? To go looking for a thing that's already killed 4 people with the intention of standing in front of it and looking it in the eye. I understand. He may not know you. Whatever recognizes you now might not be your father anymore. It might only be an animal wearing what's left of the shape." "I understand that too." Elias's voice was steady, though his hands in his lap were not. "I still need to see." Etchohana was quiet a long while, turning something over. Not doubt, Elias realized, but calculation, the working out of how a thing might be done without either of them dying in the doing of it. "All right," he said finally. "They found it 3 nights later at the full of the moon in the wash. Because of course it was the wash," Etchohana said grimly. "Because a creature circling the edges of what it used to be will always be drawn back to the last place it remembers being a man." The moon came up swollen and orange through the dust, exactly as it had the night the story began, and Elias stood in the same spot on the same stretch of dry ground where his father's absence had first become official 10 years before, his rifle heavy and useless in his hands, and waited. It came without sound, which was somehow worse than any roar could have been, simply arrived at the edge of the firelight, 7 feet of matted fur and wrongly jointed limbs, standing the way a man stands, breathing the way a bellows breathes. Its eyes caught the firelight and held there, amber, unmistakable. The one thing about it that had not changed in 10 years of whatever it had become. Elias's father's eyes set into a face that was no longer by any measure his father's face. "Don't run," Etchohana said, low from where he stood a few feet off, rifle low but ready. "Don't raise the gun unless I tell you. Let it look at you." The creature did look. For a long, terrible, suspended moment, it simply stood at the edge of the light and looked at Elias, the way a man looks at something he is trying through some fog to remember, head tilted, breath ragged, one clawed hand opening and closing slowly at its side, an old, human gesture trapped in a hand that could no longer make anything gentle of it. "Papa!" The word came out of Elias before he decided to say it, cracked in half. The voice of a boy of 13 finally, after 10 years, given somewhere to put a question he'd never been allowed to ask. Something moved behind those amber eyes, recognition, or the ghost of it, or nothing at all except an animal responding to a familiar sound. The creature took one step forward and then another, and Etchohana's rifle came up in the same instant, a warning, not yet a shot. "Elias!" It was Etchohana who said it, sharp, but Elias, staring into that terrible transformed face, would swear until the end of his life that for one heartbeat the sound that came out of the creature's throat, low and broken and buried under a decade of fur and fang, had shaped the same word. Then the moment broke. Whether it was the smell of the rifle oil, or some final collapse of whatever human thread had held for that one heartbeat, the creature's face convulsed into something with no recognition left in it at all, and it came at them with the speed of something that had spent 10 years learning to kill. What followed, Elias would only ever describe in fragments, even to himself. The impossible strength of the blow that knocked him from his feet, the white heat of claws opening his forearm as he threw it up to protect his face. Etchohana's voice, shouting something in a language Elias didn't know. the flat crack of a rifle shot that did nothing but turn the creature's fury toward the tracker instead. It was Etchohana, in the end, who put himself between the creature and Elias's fallen body, who took a blow meant to end Elias's life across his own shoulder and back, who did not fall, though the sound he made doing it would stay with Elias for the rest of his own life. It was Etchohana's second shot, placed with a steadiness that seemed impossible given what his body had just absorbed, that finally drove the creature back, stumbling into the dark of the wash, trailing a low, awful sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a man's cry of pain. It did not come back that night. Elias, bleeding, half carried by a man who was bleeding worse, understood without being told that the fight was not over, only paused, the way a held breath is paused before it must eventually break. Etchohana's wound was deep, but not, he insisted through clenched teeth, as Elias packed it with clean cloth by lamplight, mortal. The claws had opened muscle across his shoulder blade, but missed the great vessels beneath. A fact he stated with the flat certainty of a man who had tended far worse wounds than his own, and knew the difference between dying and merely suffering. "You should be in a bed," Elias said. "I should ride for the doctor." "The doctor can't do anything I haven't already done for myself," Etchohana said. "And that thing will come back before any doctor could reach us. It's wounded. Wounded animals don't retreat to think things over. They come back to finish what started." He was right. It came back 2 nights later, not at the wash this time, but at the ranch itself, as though something in it had finally, fully let go of whatever thin thread had kept it circling its old life at a respectful distance. Elias heard it in the barn before he saw it, the horses screaming, wood splintering, and ran out into moonlight with his father's rifle already raised, Etchohana half a step behind him, despite a shoulder that should have kept him in bed for a week. What happened in the yard behind the Vance ranch that night was not the kind of fight either man had trained for. It was close and ugly and short in the way that violence between overmatched creatures always is. Elias remembered afterward only pieces, disconnected, the way a nightmare is remembered, the weight of the creature bearing him to the ground, the smell of it, blood and matted fur, and something underneath that was, impossibly still faintly human. Etchohana's voice, steady even now, calling out words that were not commands, but something closer to a name, an old name, a word, in a language that predated the fences and the wash and the town by centuries, spoken not as a weapon, but as an offering. And then Elias would never be entirely certain afterward whether what happened next was mercy or exhaustion, or something in the creature that had finally, after 10 years, remembered enough of itself to choose. The amber eyes above him stopped their fury, held his own eyes, human and terrified, and 11 years older than the boy who'd last seen this face across a supper table for one long, unbearable moment. Then the weight lifted. The creature turned from him, stumbling, and went for the rifle Etchohana had raised instead. Not in continued attack, Elias understood later, lying in the dirt with his ears ringing and his chest heaving, but almost as though it had turned its own death toward itself, the way an animal caught in a trap will sometimes at the last stop fighting the jaw and simply wait. The shot, when it came, was final. Elias buried what was left in the wash, alone, the following dawn, because it seemed to him the only place that made any sense. The place where the lie had begun 10 years before, and where the truth had finally, terribly, ended. He did not mark the grave. He did not tell the town what he had found, because there was no way to tell it that would not sound like the ravings of a grief-broken man, and because some things he had come to understand are not owed to a town's curiosity. But before he closed the earth over it, he took one thing, a single claw, black and curved and heavier than it looked, that had come loose in the fighting and lay half buried in the dirt beside the grave. He cleaned it and kept it, wrapped in the same cloth his mother had once used to wrap her husband's mended shirts, and wore it after that on a leather cord beneath his collar, where no one in town would ever think to look for it or ask what it meant. Etchohana healed slowly through that winter. In the small line shack Elias insisted on building for him on the edge of the ranch, though the tracker never fully agreed he needed the charity and never fully left either. They did not speak often of that November night by the wash. Some things, both men had come to understand, did not need to be spoken to be carried. There is a particular kind of grief that does not end when the thing that caused it is finally, truly gone. It only changes shape. The way water changes shape without ever stopping being water. Elias Vance had grieved his father once, at 13, over an empty box, and a lie he had not known was a lie. He grieved him again at 23, over a grave. He dug himself in a dry wash at dawn, this time knowing exactly what he was burying, and exactly what it had cost his father to become it, and exactly what it had cost him to finally let it rest. Some curses end in vengeance. Some end only in understanding, which is a colder, quieter kind of ending, and perhaps, in its way, a crueler one. Because vengeance at least gives a man someone to blame besides the person he loved. Elias still wears the claw beneath his shirt. He does not explain it when the leather cord shows above his collar and someone asks. He only says, if pressed, that it belonged to his father, and lets the listener decide for themselves what kind of man leaves his son a claw instead of a watch or a ring, never telling them the truth, which is that some men leave behind exactly what they became and trust their children to carry it without breaking. If this story found something in you tonight, stay a while longer. There are other curses, other winters, other suns standing in other washes with their father's eyes looking back at them from the dark. Subscribe, and let's meet in the next one.